The Subcommittee on Space will come to order. Good morning. Welcome to today's hearing titled Space Traffic Management, How to Prevent a Real-Life Gravity. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biography, and truth in testimony disclosure for today's witnesses. Before I begin my opening statement, let me say that the topic we're discussing is one that I know is of great interest to Chairman Steve Palazzo, and he would be here leading the discussion today if it had not been pulled away by the death of a close friend this week. I also understand he'll be including a statement for the record. I would like to offer my condolences to him and his family during this time. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. The focus of this hearing is how to prevent a real-life gravity. As was imaginatively portrayed by Hollywood last year, the threat of debris in key orbits around the Earth is a very real and serious issue. While the movie elevated orbital debris to the forefront of the public's attention, this committee is no stranger to the topic. Today we will continue assessing the key questions involved in space traffic management and what Congress may do to ensure the safety and security of the space environment. There are two important facets of this discussion. The first is an assessment of what we are doing right now to track and mitigate orbital debris. The second is what more needs to be done without burdening the space industry with unnecessary bureaucratic hurdles to success. At present, the Joint Functional Component Command for Space, or JFCC Space, is tracking approximately 23,000 objects in orbit around the Earth, including 4,000 payloads, of which 1,200 are active. The current systems available for tracking cannot detect objects smaller than 4 inches in size. This means we can't track a fleck of paint traveling at 17,500 miles an hour, which in and of itself, although small, can cause serious damage. The Chinese anti-satellite test in 2007 demonstrated just how volatile the space environment can be. This test resulted in the largest creation of debris in history. So far, almost 3,400 individual objects associated with this event have been cataloged, and the list is still growing. Additionally, in 2000, the collision of a decommissioned Russian communications satellite, dubbed Cosmos 2251, and an active U.S. communications satellite called Iridium 33 created a debris field that resulted in over 2,000 pieces of debris. Combined, these two events can account for almost a quarter of all the objects that JFCC is tracking. While tracking existing debris is obviously key to this discussion, we must also focus on preventing the proliferation of these objects in the first place. There are two key agencies involved in the mitigation of debris: the Federal Aviation Administration and the Federal Communications Commission. Both of these agencies have developed regulations specific to the creation of orbital debris, and I'm eager to hear from them today. The FAA is responsible for the mitigation of debris as it pertains to launch and reentry of transportation vehicles. The National Space Transportation Policy, released in November of 2013, directed the Department of Transportation to execute exclusive authority over these activities. While this was not a change in the status quo, Dr. George Neild, Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation at the FAA, testified before the subcommittee that his agency was ready to start a larger discussion on expansion of their authority to regulate on-orbit activities. It is unclear what specific authority the FAA is asking for and how it would anticipate working with other agencies to implement this authority. Regardless of the administration's plans, Congress will need to carefully weigh the costs and benefits of increased authority for the FAA against the possible over-regulation of a still very young industry. In 2005, the FCC asserted jurisdiction to regulate orbital debris from commercial satellites, which require their licenses for the use of spectrum. The Commission based this assertion largely on the broad mandate in the Communications Act of 1934 to encourage, quote, the larger and more effective use of radio in the public interest, end quote. Although Congress has not provided authority for this type of regulation explicitly, there seems to be some ambiguity in the nature of their mandate to utilize the spectrum effectively and efficiently. The efforts of federal agencies should be viewed within the context of separate international and private sector efforts. The United States has the most advanced space situational awareness system in the world, but tracking and cataloging the space environment more effectively may come from key partnerships. We cannot afford to ignore these important partners. As commercial human space flight increases in the coming decades, We must be sure that the nation can protect the health, welfare, and safety of our government astronauts and private spaceflight participants. It is also imperative that we secure key orbits to protect assets that are critical to our economy. Similarly, we cannot allow national security assets that are used to keep our country safe to be threatened by the proliferation of debris. The debris events caused by the Cosmos and Iridium collision in 2000 and China's ASAT test in 2007 demonstrated that the space environment is vulnerable and ever-changing. We must be vigilant to ensure our national interests are protected. I appreciate the appearance of our witnesses today, and I look forward to hearing from them. I now recognize the ranking member from Maryland, Ms. Edwards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to everyone to today's hearing. Mr. Chairman, while the accuracy of the events depicted in the fictional movie Gravity can be questioned, there's no doubt that it's made the public at least a little bit more aware of the danger of orbital debris, and that's probably a good thing. But in the real world, the nature of the danger was brought into stark focus by the aftermath of the 2007 anti-satellite test conducted by China. This incident is said to have created an estimated debris population of 150,000 objects larger than 1 centimeter in size. The resulting increase in space debris has made the space environment more hazardous to military, civil, and commercial satellites and spacecraft for years to come. So what are we doing to make space travel safe from orbital debris? Well, today a number of government agencies have a role in orbital debris mitigation. 3 of those agencies are represented on the panel today. The DoD's Strategic Command is responsible for tracking orbital debris. The FCC has jurisdiction for mitigating orbital debris from satellites, and FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation regulates orbital debris from commercially licensed launch and reentry vehicles. However, what isn't quite clear is which agencies have or could have legitimate roles in space traffic management. That is, the authority to tell a space operator to move a spacecraft should the potential for collision from debris or another spacecraft require it. Other questions also come to mind. Should space traffic management be carried out by one or more existing agencies or perhaps by a new organization? What needs to happen for the information on space debris and potential collisions to get to the people who need it and when they need it? Is the current system for information transfer working, or does it need improvement? Because the causes and consequences of orbital debris are international in scope, does successful space traffic management require an international approach? And lastly, what liability should the agency or agencies in charge of space traffic management assume if its direction to a satellite operator to move a spacecraft results in a collision? These are just a few of the questions that this subcommittee will need to address if we aim to lay the groundwork for ensuring the safety of future spaceflight from orbital debris and other spacecraft. Mr. Chairman, these are complex issues, and so I hope today's hearing will start to shed light not only on the important issue of orbital debris, but also on the approaches Congress might consider for a potential space traffic management and regulatory regime. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee from Texas, Ms. Johnson, for a statement.
Thank you very much, and good morning. I want to welcome our witnesses to this morning's hearing, and I look forward to your testimony. I'll be brief in my remarks so that we'll have enough time to hear from my experts. Orbital debris, or space junk, as it is sometimes called, is not science fiction. It is a reality and something that has implications for the way we operate both our crewed spacecraft and our commercial and government satellites. It is a growing problem. Dealing with the increase in orbital debris will not be easy, as our witnesses will testify the issues associated with its mitigation and its potential removal from orbit or complex. A number of agencies are involved, not all of whom are represented at today's hearing, but I am pleased that the bipartisan NASA reauthorization bill that we recently marked up now contains several provisions related to orbital debris. I believe that their inclusion is a useful start to addressing this complex set of issues. That said, I would caution against legislating further in this area until we have a better understanding of the issues involved. This morning's hearing will provide a good starting point for members to learn about both the challenge presented by orbital debris as well as some of the potential approaches to dealing with that challenge. I am pleased that this subcommittee is holding this hearing. In closing, I again want to welcome our witnesses, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I would like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Lieutenant General John J. Raymond, Commander, 14th Air Force Space Command, and Commander, Joint Functional Component Command for Space, U.S. Strategic Command. As the U.S. Air Force's operational space component to U.S. STRATCOM, General Raymond leads more than 20,500 personnel responsible for providing missile warning, space superiority, space situational awareness, satellite operations, space launch, and range operations. As Commander, JFCC Space, he directs all assigned and attached U.S. STRATCOM space forces, providing tailored, responsive, timely, local, and global space effects in support of national USS STRATCOM and combatant commander objectives. Our second witness today is Mr. George Zamka, Deputy Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation at the Federal Aviation Administration. Mr. Zamka came to the FAA directly from NASA, where he served as an astronaut and most recently as a research and instructor pilot at the Johnson Space Center. He is a retired colonel in the Marine Corps, and as a pilot has more than 5,000 flight hours in fighter, attack, test, research, and training aircraft. He was selected as an astronaut by NASA in June 1998. He has spent more than 692 hours in space. Our third witness is Mr. Robert Nelson, Chief Engineer, International Bureau, Federal Communications Commission. He is responsible for leading the Bureau's work on technical issues, including satellite communications and cross-border technical issues. Prior to serving as the Bureau's Chief Engineer, he was Chief of the Bureau's Satellite Division and Chief of the Satellite Division Engineering Branch. Before joining the Commission, Mr. Nelson had various engineering positions in the private sector. Our fourth witness is Mr. P.J. Blount, Adjunct Professor of Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi School of Law. He is also an Adjunct Professor in the Department of Political Science and Law at Montclair State University. Previously, he served as Research Counsel for the National Center for Remote Sensing, Air, and Space Law at the University of Mississippi School of Law. He teaches space security law, international telecommunications law, human rights law, and cyber law. He serves as the Assistant Executive Secretary of the International Institute of Space Law. Our final witness is Mr. Brian Weeden, Technical Advisor at the Secure World Foundation. As Technical Advisor, Mr. Weeden conducts research on space debris, global space situational awareness, space traffic management, protection of space assets, and space governance. Prior to joining SWF, Mr. Weeden served on active duty as an officer in the United States Air Force, working in space and intercontinental ballistic missile operations. As part of U.S. Strategic Command's Joint Space Operations Center, Mr. Weeden directed the Orbital Analyst Training Program and developed tactics, techniques, and procedures for improving space situational awareness. As our witness should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which the members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. I now recognize General Raymond for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Chairman Brooks, Representative Edwards, members of the subcommittee, it's an honor to appear before you as the United States Strategic Command's commander of the Joint Functional Component Command for Space. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to address the committee, and I look forward to working with you to advance our nation's space capabilities. Before going further, though, I'd ask, if I could be so bold to ask you for a favor, and just please pass along my condolences to Chairman Palazzo. It's my highest honor to represent the 3,300 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines and civilians that make up the Joint Functional Component Command for Space. These professionals, along with our exchange officers from Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, ensure our nation, our allies, and our joint warfighters have continued access to the space capabilities that enable the American way of life. JFCC Space is the world's premier provider of space situational awareness data and products. Over the past few years, we have bolstered our commercial and international partnerships. We've implemented two-way sharing agreements, and we've worked collaboratively to refine our sharing processes. Additionally, we are on track to deliver a new command and control system called the Joint Space Operations Center Mission System, or JMS for short, and additional space situational awareness sensors, the combination of which will give us increased capability and improved space situational awareness for the United States and our partners. Although maintaining awareness of the space domain is no small task, I am confident that the men and women of JFCC Space are prepared to meet the challenges with a spirit of dedicated innovation and devotion to duty, providing our nation, our allies, and our joint warfighters assured access to the world's premier space capabilities. I thank the committee for your continued support as we strive to preserve the space domain and enhance the space capabilities which are so vital to our nation.
Thank you for your timely testimony. The chair next recognizes Mr. Zamka for his testimony.
Chairman Brooks, Ranking Member Edwards, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me. This is my first opportunity to speak before the subcommittee, and I am particularly fortunate to be able to speak about the FAA's efforts regarding orbital debris mitigation. Aside from launch and reentry, orbital debris poses the highest risk to human spaceflight. During my 2 space missions, we flew upside down and backwards to protect our shuttle windows from orbital debris, and even doing that, we had debris strikes and cracks on our windows from very small debris strikes. With regard to orbital debris mitigation, it is helpful to review the operations to which the FAA's authority applies and where it does not. The FAA is the sole federal government agency with authority to license commercial space transportation activities. That authority is limited by the Commercial Space Launch Act to the launch and reentry of a vehicle. Under that authority, at the end of launch, the FAA requires the operator of a launch vehicle to safe their vehicle and ensure there is no post-separation contact with their deploying payload in order to prevent orbital debris generation. The FAA also imposes launch window limitations based on a launch collision avoidance analysis with human spacecraft such as the International Space Station. The FAA does not currently have authority to regulate on orbit. The only agencies with any regulatory authority in between launch and reentry events are the FCC for communication satellites and NOAA for remote sensing satellites. The FAA interfaces with the FCC and NOAA regularly through payload reviews, and our primary partners in developing effective orbital debris rules are the Department of Defense and NASA. The NASA Orbital Debris Program Office has been a strong partner in the development of FAA rules and is an invaluable resource. The DoD's Joint Space Operations Center, or JSPOC, provides tracking information and debris detection data that we use to evaluate the effectiveness of launch debris mitigation efforts. Only the DoD has legislative authority and capability to share space situational awareness information, including notifications of impending collisions and near collisions to cooperating space operators, but it lacks any enforcement authority. An issue of oversight and enforcement authority emerges with the increasing number of commercial space transportation vehicles, which will operate differently from communications or Earth-observing satellites. Rather than travel to and remain in one stable orbit, commercial transportation vehicles will move in between orbits and rendezvous with, attach to, and deliver cargo and people to other orbiting space vehicles. These orbital operations could cause collisions that would create orbital debris. As Congress explores the issue of orbital debris and transportation hazards, the FAA urges the subcommittee to consider at least 2 possible options, separately or in combination. First, it should consider whether a regulatory agency should authorize transportation on orbit by license. In that scenario, an agency with the proper expertise would, as part of a license evaluation, review the operator's plans and debris mitigation measures in advance of operations. In a second scenario that may require additional discussion, we would consider the benefits of an agency with enforcement authority providing notices of impending hazards and collisions. That agency would serve as a referee, advising of impending high-risk events and facilitating a safer orbital environment for all commercial and governmental operators. This subcommittee is familiar with the orbital debris environment that consists of spent rocket bodies and debris traveling in different directions at speeds 5 to 10 times that of a bullet and carrying tremendous energy into any collision. Because of minimal atmospheric drag in Earth orbit, objects in orbit tend to stay in orbit at least for a very long time. For example, Tyros 2, which was launched over a half-century ago, was recently added to the 60-day reentry prediction list. Collisions between orbiting objects can cause a lot of debris. We talked about the Iridium Cosmos collision that created over 2,000 of the 23,000 tracked objects on orbit. Orbital debris affects human spaceflight as well. The ISS has executed 18 debris avoidance maneuvers, and ISS crew members have been required to shelter in their Soyuz lifeboats at times when hazardous debris was detected with too little warning to plan and carry out a debris avoidance maneuver. As space transportation capabilities and operations continue to advance, and as the risk posed by orbital debris increases, plans for mitigation become ever more critical. It is time to explore the orbital safety of commercial space transportation under the Commercial Space Launch Act. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my prepared remarks, and I will be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Zamka. The chair now recognizes Mr. Nelson for 5 minutes.
Chairman Brooks, Ranking Member Edwards, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to speak with you today about the FCC's role in orbital debris mitigation and how we fit into the overall efforts of the United States government with respect to this issue. In 1973, the FCC licensed the first purely private U.S. communication satellites, and the first such satellite began operations in the geosynchronous orbit in 1974, slightly more than 40 years ago. Under the Communications Act, the FCC is charged with licensing radio communications. The Act recognized that radio transmissions do not stop at national boundaries, and as a result of the Act was drafted with the understanding that regulation needed to extend outside the territorial boundaries of the United States. At the same time, FCC licensing does not extend to U.S. federal government transmitters, which are authorized by NTIA and the Commerce Department. FCC licensing and regulation are governed by a core principle of the Communications Act, that issuing a license requires a finding that the public interest must be served. In that vein, the FCC in 2004, recognizing work done by NASA and other agencies, adopted debris mitigation regulations for the satellite services it licenses. The FCC concluded that debris mitigation rules would help preserve the United States' continued affordable access to space, the continued provision of reliable U.S. space-based services, as well as the continued safety of persons and property in space and on the surface of the Earth. FCC satellite licenses have always included, as one of the terms, the assignment of an orbital location. Deviation from that license term is basis for an enforcement action. The FCC licensing process includes an opportunity for public comment, and this has, on occasion, resulted in objections to a proposed license modification based on collision risk. In 2004, debris mitigation rules added a requirement to describe debris mitigation plans. Specifically, the FCC rules require license applicants to describe steps taken to avoid accidental explosions, to identify and avoid collision risks, and to safely dispose of the satellite at the end of its mission. The FCC rules also include a requirement to dispose of geostationary satellites, consistent with an International Telecommunications Union recommendation adopted in 2003, and a requirement that all satellites be left in a safe configuration. The satellite applicants' plans are evaluated as a part of the licensing process. The FCC is one of 3 agencies that license U.S. commercial activities in space, the other 2 being the FAA for launch and reentry activities, and NOAA for remote sensing. Consistent with long-established radio frequency management processes, the FCC is the licensing authority for radio frequency use by private launch vehicles and remote sensing satellites. However, the FCC has recognized the FAA's statutory role under the Commercial Space Launch Act, and it recently reiterated that it would not apply its debris mitigation rules to commercial space transportation activities that are subject to FAA regulation. The FCC also recognized NOAA's statutory role concerning post-mission disposal of the remote sensing satellites it licenses. Although the FCC licensing process is independent from NOAA and FAA processes, the FCC consults with these agencies as needed. Consultation is often related to status of particular cases and the progress of licensing activities. Further, FCC's regulations and licensing make use of scientific and technical work done by NASA. The FCC does not operate any orbital debris tracking equipment, such as radar and telescopes, and like much of commercial satellite industry, the FCC's main sources of satellite tracking data are DoD's JSPOC, as well as the satellite operators themselves, derived from their radio links with their satellites. The efforts to improve space situational awareness of the JSPOC and commercial operators through such mechanisms as the Space Data Association are an important element to an overall debris mitigation strategy. To be clear, data sharing between JSPOC and commercial operators is on a spacecraft operator to spacecraft operator basis. The FCC is not an intermediary in this process. In conclusion, I thank the committee for this opportunity to describe the FCC's rules concerning orbital debris mitigation, the source of the FCC's authority on these rules, and the FCC's interaction with other federal government agencies concerning this important topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. The chair now recognizes Mr. Blount for 5 minutes.
Chairman Brooks, Ranking Member Edwards, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss this important topic. Space traffic management is a complex issue, and I'll try to briefly summarize my written statement. Space traffic management as a concept contains two different elements. These are the technical capabilities needed to control space traffic and the legal regime which governs appropriate behavior. I will primarily be addressing the legal aspects of space traffic management and will do so in the context of the international obligations of the United States. International space law encompasses a variety of principles that set the bounds of appropriate state conduct in outer space. These principles are broad in scope and largely undefined. The lack of definition means that the United States is in a unique position to influence the content of these norms to help create a safe and secure space environment. International space law grants all states the right of free access to outer space. Additionally, states shall, under Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, engage in space activities with due regard to the corresponding interests of other states. And states are given a right and an obligation to seek consultations when there may be harmful interference between space activities. This treaty provision emphasizes international cooperation and coordination in space activities. Article 9 also creates an obligation to not harmfully contaminate the space environment. Under Article 6 of the same treaty, states are internationally responsible for the activities of non-governmental actors and are required to authorize and continually supervise these activities. This is an extraordinary provision in international law, which generally does not hold states responsible for the activities of their non-governmental actors. This provision gives states an affirmative obligation to oversee non-governmental actors to ensure that they behave responsibly in space. As I have already mentioned, these provisions are substantially undefined. They require states to engage in space activities in such a manner as to preserve space for use and exploration by all for peaceful purposes. However, these provisions leave the contours of what constitutes responsible behavior up to states, who have traditionally cooperated and coordinated on an ad hoc basis. Notably, these provisions have failed to set meaningful limits on the creation of orbital debris. The United States has traditionally been a leader in the development of international space law, and space traffic management should be no different. When provisions of treaties are unclear, state practice in regard to those provisions often help to define the content and meaning of those provisions. For example, following the United States lead, the Article 6 obligation to authorize and supervise has been implemented by states as licensing regimes. The United States is in a unique position in the development of domestic space traffic management regime to influence the meaning of international norms and the international frameworks developed to coordinate space traffic management among states. To this end, in my written testimony, I have identified 3 key principles that should be taken into account when developing a domestic space traffic management system. First, mechanisms providing for data transparency and access are critical to ensuring proper management of space traffic. It is essential to controlling domestic operations as well as coordinating international cooperation. Second, a space traffic management system whether organized in one agency or many, needs to ensure that a government agency has unambiguous jurisdiction during all phases of space operations. This provides regulatory predictability, which can help foster the commercial space industry, and it also ensures that the United States complies with its obligation to continually supervise non-governmental actors. Finally, whatever government entity or entities is vested with the jurisdiction to manage space traffic, that agency needs also to be vested with technical competence to ensure that it can properly oversee these operations. Jurisdiction to manage operations will be meaningless without the technical capabilities to do so. The maintenance of a safe and secure space environment is in the national interest of the United States. Civil, commercial, and military operations are all dependent on a space environment free of interference from other actors. To this end, the United States should be a leader in developing a space traffic management system that can foster such an environment both domestically and internationally. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. Thank you again for the opportunity. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Blount. The chair now recognizes Mr. Weeden for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Brooks, Ranking Member Edwards, distinguished members of the subcommittee. Secure World Foundation is dedicated to the long-term sustainability of the space environment so that all of humanity can continue to use space for benefits here on Earth. The growth in space debris and increasing congestion of critical regions of Earth orbit present significant challenges to space sustainability. And addressing those challenges is a key part of our work. Regarding the threat that space debris poses, there are 3 categories of complementary activities that can help address that challenge. The first is space debris mitigation, limiting the creation of new debris from human activities in space. The second is active debris removal, also known as remediation, which aims to remove some of the existing pieces of debris to help prevent future growth in the debris population or to reduce the collision risk to satellites in highly congested regions. The third activity is space traffic management, which I define in my testimony as minimizing the negative impact of space debris on space activities. All 3 of these activities are enabled by a fourth, space situation awareness, broadly defined as characterizing the space environment and its impact on activities in space. The U.S. government's strong efforts on space debris mitigation over the last decade and a half are a good start, but need to be part of a more comprehensive approach. My written testimony outlines 3 major steps that can be taken in this direction. The first is to find ways to harmonize the implementation of the debris mitigation guidelines across the various regulatory agencies that currently have authority. Doing so can result in a more efficient and effective process with benefits to commercial industry and innovation. Second, this subcommittee can call on the executive branch to articulate a comprehensive strategy for dealing with existing space debris, which may potentially include active debris removal. Third, the subcommittee can work with the executive branch and other committees with jurisdiction to re-examine the roles and responsibilities for space situation awareness and space traffic management. The key question facing the U.S. government moving forward is whether or not the Department of Defense should continue to be the single federal agency responsible for all space situation awareness activities and providing operational space traffic management for the world. I believe the answer is no. While space surveillance began as a national security function, it has evolved into more than just national security. It plays a fundamental role in the breadth of space activities being conducted by not only the military, but also civil government agencies and the private sector. Thus, I believe it is time for the U.S. government to shift responsibility for part of the SSA mission that directly supports safety of space flight to a federal entity other than the DoD. This shift will allow this new entity to focus on building relationships with commercial and foreign actors, take better advantage of private sector innovation, and establish trusted services with all space actors. The DoD would certainly retain responsibility for and a focus on the national security aspects. Making this change is not without considerable challenges. First and foremost is determining which federal department or agency should be assigned this new role. One option is to assign it to an agency that already has existing authority for regulating and licensing private sector space activities. Another option is to assign it to a federal agency that already has significant expertise in space operations and space debris. A third option would be to assign it to a new federal agency with both regulatory powers and operational responsibility. Which of these options is best depends upon the long-term priorities and goals for the U.S. government and the role it wants to play in global space activities. This proposed shift in responsibility, I believe, puts the U.S. government in a better position to harness the private sector innovation currently ongoing and improve its own capabilities and security in orbit. It is very similar to the DoD's current approach for both satellite communications and space-based remote sensing. In both of these areas, the government focuses its efforts on exclusive niche capabilities the private sector cannot provide. The end result has been an increased capability for the military, lower cost to the taxpayer, and a booming commercial industry. It has become almost trite to point out that the space world has changed, but in the context of this hearing, it is worth making the point again. The continuing expansion in the number of space actors, the types of space activities, has created a complex space environment. Technological diffusion has commoditized space capabilities, fueled a surge of private sector innovation, and created the possibility for many new uses of space for benefits here on Earth. It is vitally important for the U.S. government to evolve its approach to stay abreast of this ongoing change and continue to maintain its leadership role in supporting the safety of space activities and encouraging innovation. Thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Weeden, and I thank the witnesses for their testimony. As an aside, it looks like we're going to have our second set of votes somewhere around 11:30, roughly 45 minutes from now. Hopefully we'll be able to complete these proceedings before those House floor votes are called. Reminding members that committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes, the chair will at this point open the round of questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. As a part of my 5 minutes and recognizing the prerogative that the chair has, I would like to at this point recognize the Falcon Rocket team from Huntsville, Alabama. If you would please stand. We've got Coach Bobby Murphy here with us, members John Aslan, Jack Aslan, Victor Murphy, Dave Green, Matt Kellogg, and Jorge Estrada. The competition is tomorrow. They're representing the state of Alabama. And I want to encourage you all to do what you can to represent our community, in as much as we often boast that we're the birthplace of America's human spaceflight program. And thank you for being here for this hearing today. This challenge that we're facing today may be one that we need you all to solve tomorrow. With that having been said, let me proceed with my, with that having been said, let me proceed with my first question. Dr. Henry Hersfeld of the George Washington University recently testified before the committee that FAA should, quote, clearly be defined and preferably limited to those issues directly related to launching and re-entry, end quote. His comments appear to be somewhat inconsistent with the request that the FAA is making here today. Can each of you comment on Dr. Hersfeld's statement concerning the FAA's potential role in this space debris matter? Go ahead, at your leisure, whoever wants to poke the button first.
Chairman, it seems like I might be the liable first guy. The FAA's current authority ends at the end of launch. That's the last time an operator has contact with their launch vehicle, and it begins at the beginning of reentry. That's when the safety checks begin. So that's our current authority. What we have experience with is talking to the operators and dealing with orbital debris mitigation. And we're also there as they are conducting their operations as part of our inspection and enforcement function. So we have existing experience and credibility with the launch operators. The thing that I will refer to my testimony with that is new that would be worth considering are the new class of vehicles in operation. And so these are vehicles taking personnel, cargo, and servicing up to human space stations and also servicing satellites.
Sir, I would just add that, consistent with what my panelist partner just said, we work very closely with the FAA on the licensing of launch vehicles. In commercial space launches that we conduct off of our ranges, we have FAA representation there with us as we go. I would just add that we are consistent with the national space policy. We think it's important that you look at that this hearing happened and that you look at different agencies to be able to take on the lead federal agency role. I'm not going to pick one or the other, but I think it is important that you explore that, and we're interested in exploring that going forward.
While the FCC hasn't ruled on any of these on this issue, it's probably important to point out FAA has had a role in the past, for instance, with air transport and human transport issues, and the fact that they are involved directly with the launch vehicle situation, carrying that through may be an appropriate situation in regard to transport or further launch operations.
I actually do not answer this question in my testimony as to who should have this authority. I think that there are ways that we can envision either a single agency or fragmented agency authority where we have different agencies handling different functions. However, I do think that General Raymond's point about having a lead federal agency is very important. So, an agency that can coordinate this information, make sure that all the involved parties and stakeholders are coordinated is very important. And I think that currently FAA looks like the most appropriate for that, but I don't think that it's necessary that it goes there.
I would add that one of the key questions here is what kinds of powers are we talking about? And would that extend to telling satellite operators what to do? And that is a very complicated question, because a lot of these scenarios, when you're getting into potential close approach of space objects, we don't know a yes or no answer whether or not two things will collide, except in very, very specific cases, like, for example, a planned rendezvous between two satellites. In most other cases, it comes down to statistics and probability. And so you're having to make a judgment call based upon what is your level of risk. And I think the hesitancy by Dr. Hertzfeld is to give a government agency the power to somehow tell a private operator what that level of risk should be and what they should deal with. Now, I think on the other side, the situations where that would probably need to be exercised are not as numerous as many people might think. Most close approaches are between either two pieces of debris that no one controls or a satellite under control and a piece of debris. The only situations where maybe that might come into play of a mandatory control would be if perhaps human safety was in question.
Thank you. At this point, the chair recognizes the ranking member, Ms. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. I want to follow up on this because, Mr. Zamka, in your prepared statement, you are urging us to look at two issues. One is whether a regulatory agency should authorize transportation on orbit by license, and then the second is the benefits of an agency with enforcement authority providing notices regarding impending hazards and collisions. And I guess, from my standpoint, I'm really not prepared to legislate yet because I feel like there's still a lot we need to know. So I wonder if you might comment about what parties would need to be at a table and in what venue to begin to explore what Congress needs to do in this area. And might that be a better approach than going right to identifying an agency that would have authority, sweeping authority that we don't even know about yet?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for that, because we really just want to begin the exploration as to what the solution might be, and a very important part of that is having the right players at the table. So industry certainly, who has to deal with the risk and the expense, for instance, of deciding to do a debris maneuver to avoid a collision, is a difficult one. And there are a lot of working solutions that are out there amongst commercial operators that are already working, and there are numerous ways of dealing with it, shy of regulation, shy of enforcement, and so we don't want to get ahead of any particular solutions that are out there. But I'd certainly say industry and the agencies that are involved with on-orbit authority now would certainly be good players.
And before I go to Mr. Nelson, I will, General Raymond, I wonder if you could comment about the role that you would see in a future environment with a whole bunch of other actors at play, both domestically and internationally. What then is the role of the Department of Defense in this?
Well, clearly, ma'am, the Department of Defense is focused on national security. And space situational awareness is absolutely foundational to everything that we do in space for national security purposes. So when you have these discussions, one of the things that I think you need to really be careful about as we go forward is making sure that we have the ability to do what we need to do to protect our nation, protect our nation's satellites.
Great. And Mr. Nelson?
Yeah, following up on what I said earlier and Mr. Zamka's comments, I would suggest, at least from the point of view of an orbital maneuver situation or enforcing an orbital maneuver to take place, that at least from the point of view of the folks that we work with, it's in their best interest to move, and that's how they would take a look at it. If they were aware that there was going to a potential collision was coming along, I'm sure that they would end up moving that satellite in order to take care of that. It's just inherently in their best interest, especially from a financial point of view. So from having to have somebody that would have to go through and actually force them and say them to do that, it's probably an unlikely situation to carry through. And further, as you point out, the international aspects of this, we only have a certain percentage of the satellites that are on orbit, and the issue of telling some other foreign country's satellite to have to move raises its own issues.
Thank you. And Professor Blount, I wonder if you could talk to me about the liability that the agencies either should have or do have, who should be in charge of space traffic management, and what liability should they assume when it's direction to a satellite operator to move a spacecraft, or its failure to provide a timely alert that results in a collision or debris?
Can I clarify that question, that you're asking about the liability of the federal agency to the space operator?
Either the liability of that the agency has or should have.
I think that liability is a very interesting question, because these are obviously very expensive pieces of equipment that are moving at very fast speeds and can cause a lot of damage. And there is, when you define a federal agency that's going to be in charge, they take on a responsibility. And part of these points that I point out that we should have in the legislation is this idea of technological capability. And so right now that capability is vested with the DoD. And if we name a federal agency, let's say the FAA or the FCC, then there becomes a question of where are they getting their data? Are they going to have to rely on DoD to get their data, and then are they going to do this collision analysis, or are they going to have to rely on DoD to do the collision analysis, or are they going to have to rely on SDA to do the collision analysis? And so until the problems of where data comes from and how it's going to be managed by that agency come through, then it's going to be very difficult to determine who's going to be liable for these actions. I will just quickly add that at the international level, the state is liable. And so the way that we manage our domestic assets is going to be very important, the way that we interact internationally, because we could be on the hook for something that a commercial actor does.
Well, it does seem to me, and Mr. Chairman, I'll conclude, it does seem to me that there is a fair amount of risk that's inherent when you can't entirely be accurate if it comes to predicting how you move a satellite or how you move a spacecraft. So, these liability issues I think we're going to have to explore if we're going to go, shoving responsibilities some other lead agency. And with that, I yield. I think, Mr. Chairman, we have a lot more questions to ask and answer before we come to a point where we need to legislate in this area. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Bouchon of Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to focus on what do we do with the debris that's already there. And we're talking mostly about regulating a regulatory climate right now, but I'm interested in, anyone can answer this, what's happening with R&D about how to either capture or deflect the orbit of existing space debris? Because I think it seems to me that, 50 years from now, we may not even be able to fly in space if we keep going the way we are at all, because we won't be able to get out of the way of stuff flying around the Earth. So is there anything going on obviously when you capture this stuff, you have to be going at similar speeds, or else it's just going to destroy whatever you try to capture it with. Mr. Zamka, maybe you can start?
Yes, sir. It is a difficult problem because of the high speeds involved, and essentially you'd have to rendezvous with that particular piece of debris in order to capture it and then bring it down. As part of our Center of Excellence function, thanks very much for supporting that, but we have 6 studies in work to begin to characterize that debris, be able to predict where it's going to be better, and then identify potential efforts at remediation. And there are some things that are out there that could increase the drag or use a magnetic field to begin to bring those pieces down sooner. But it is a difficult problem. Probably the most important thing relative to today, though, is that any plan to remediate debris on orbit is dependent on not creating more debris now. And as we've seen, any single accident can create a tremendous amount of debris.
Yeah, and deflect, like I mean, you're pointing out, deflecting the orbit either magnetically or physically is a possibility, I guess, in some of the, I mean, it seems like we could probably come up to solve the problem for the bigger stuff, but all the little stuff, you know, like the stuff that hit the space shuttle, it's going to be really, really hard to get that stuff out of the orbit, it seems like.
Yes, sir. And one of the challenges we have is that the human space flight and our telecommunications satellites and a lot of our Earth observing satellites are all in that same low Earth orbit regime, which is where a lot of the debris is. So that's where we have to work.
Yeah. Mr. Weeden, you had a comment?
Yes. There's quite a bit of work going on this within the scientific and technical community, both on studying the problem and on looking at some technology that is still in the early level but is early stages, but with the promising ones that might need to be adapted down the road. NASA works with a number of other space agencies to do studies on this issue, and they've done a lot of modeling. One of the big questions the technical community is grappling with is, do we go after the big things or the little things? Because it generally is different types of technology. You're not going to have one solution that does both. And we probably, in doing both, means twice as much money probably. And the difference is the big debris is the source of new debris in the future. So removing them, you're kind of controlling long-term growth. But the small debris is the current threat to satellites. So removing that is a short-term lowering of risk. And that's kind of a choice between which strategy is more important. And that debate's going on right now within the scientific community.
Okay. As far as mitigation in the future, and this would apply probably only to U.S. players because we can't control the international community, but is there any talk about penalizing financially people that generate space junk? Anyone want to talk about that? I mean, it seems to me if you're a private entity or you put something up into space and it generates a bunch of problems, you know, what can we do about that? Is there a way to financially address that?
There have been discussions and proposals, mostly in academic journals in the past, of some sort of a tax or something on people that generate debris. The recurring problem is who has authority to put that in place. As you mentioned, it's an international environment. There are more than 60 countries that are now launching satellites and space objects, and each of them has authority over their own private sector activities.
Yeah, let me just point out, I mean, I'm not promoting new taxation.
Yep.
Like if you fly something into space, you get taxed ahead of time. However, let me just point out that the reality is if there is not some incentive not to do something, I wouldn't call it a tax, I'd call it a penalty. If you do, say you send something up, it blows up and generates 1,000 pieces of space junk. You know, if you send something up, nothing happens, it comes down, fine. But if you know, there has to be some incentive for people not to generate this stuff.
I would say there is an added complication that in the areas where debris is the worst, mainly low Earth orbit between about 600 to 800 kilometers, it is mostly government satellites. There's not a lot at the moment. There's not a lot of private sector activity there.
But there will be.
There will be in the future, but at the moment there is not a lot there. So the question is, how do you incentivize governments?
Yeah. Yeah. Good luck. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bouchon. The chair now recognizes Mr. Schweikert of Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's sometimes terrifying what makes us laugh, isn't it? It's, first question, and I just want to make sure I sort of understand some of the hierarchy and the mechanics. First off, a U.S. But private commercial satellite, direct TV or satellite television or something of that nature, it's put up in space. Doesn't carry insurance. Mr. Nelson.
Yes. Most companies do have insurance on their satellites. Larger ones may actually self-insure, so they'll put up money based on the fact they have a lot.
But whether they put up the fund or something, but somehow there's an insurance product there.
Yes.
How about if I'm the French or East Indian or private telecommunication or private cable, or television provider? Do they carry insurance? Do they have a national indemnity? And considering they're often
from different countries have different rules concerning how they go about. As an example, one I'm aware of is the United Kingdom. For any of the folks that might launch under their flag, they have a Space Act, and some of the requirements, for instance, is indemnification of the crown, so to speak. So it depends on the country and what the rules are associated with their activity.
And Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses, where I'm trying to head is these are very expensive objects, both both those from the private and those that are governmental. Have great value. We already know there's sort of an insurance regime of some mix. It may not be, universal in design. So we know we have incentives because of the value. We know there's some structure out there. So what happens today? How do they communicate today? General, let's say we have, you see something heading towards my DirecTV satellite. Do you communicate with them?
Congressman, thanks for the question. Absolutely. We are very interested in maintaining a safe space domain. So my organization, and specifically the command center that I have, the Joint Space Operations Center located at Vandenberg Air Force Base, tracks the 23,000 objects that you've heard about. And of those objects, we not only do we track them, but we detect for potential conjunctions.
But what I'm after right now, because that was part of your testimony and that was very helpful, is sort of the communication regime right now. So it's the satellite that's providing television for Australia. Right. Do you communicate with them?
We do. So where I was going, if we detect a potential conjunction on any active satellite that's up in space, any country, if we detect a conjunction, we'll make an emergency notification because it's in all of our best interests not to have it.
Now, is it bilateral? Does it come the other direction where the private tracking firm that's managing, do they communicate back to you?
Yes, sir. We have two-way sharing agreements with about 41 different companies. We have it with 5 different nations. There is two-way sharing going back and forth. Largely, though, the tracking capabilities that are out there are our tracking capabilities, and largely we're the ones that are doing this for the world.
And do any of those private firms ever provide their statistics saying, hey, we actually believe you've missed our orbit by a few yards, a few degrees, we have some wobble, we have some elliptical. Do they share that sort of data back and forth?
For those that we have agreements with, they provide what we call owner-operator, the address in space, if you will. We track it with a radar. They have the exact address of theirs, and they do provide that back and forth. The challenge that we have today is that our command and control system that we have doesn't allow us to automatically ingest that. We are putting a new command system in place as we speak called the Joint Space Mission Operations Center system that will allow that automatic ingestion of owner-operator data.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, as my buddy here and we were talking sort of one-off a moment ago, as we see the commercialization of space, we know we have the incentives. We have very valuable objects up there. We know we have the need. We know we have sort of a communication structure, and we also know it's ultimately going to be international. Is there a way where we could ever get these parties where they have sort of an automated information exchange back and forth, and others are also carrying the cost of this? So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schweikert. The chair next recognizes Mr. Hall, the former chair of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee.
Of course, thank you for holding this hearing. I guess, General Raymond, some time ago, maybe 15 years ago, we had a hearing on asteroids. And to our surprise, we found out one had just passed in what they said was 15 minutes of the United States. Nobody knew about it, or no one gave us any warning about it or spoke about it. And I invited people from France, England, Japan, and others. Japan's the only one that answered because it's a world problem, not just the U.S. But got very little hope from most of the, very few of them showed up. But we had some good hearings on that, and there's some things that would scare you to death. I guess give us some kind of a sense of the process that goes in when you want to protect our national security and our commercial assets that could be threatened by orbital debris, and what other degree there is. Or how much warning did NASA have to avoid their threats that they've had? I think they had one. There have been instances where they have. Just give us a general answer to my question. If it's too general,
Sir, we track, as we said, every object. We do that for NASA as well. We actually have NASA operators that sit on our JSPOC floor with us. We take very seriously the protection of the International Space Station. You heard from our previous panelists that the space station had moved 16 times. In fact, just last month, we recommended to NASA that they move it twice. There's a layered approach to doing this. We detect where the debris is, and then as it gets into a certain area around the space station, we then put more energy on that debris, refine the orbital accuracy of our position estimate of that debris, and then we make recommendations with the folks sitting on the floor. So it's something that we take very seriously, and there's a set process with NASA operators. We also do that for all of our DoD satellites. And again, as I mentioned earlier, for any conjunction that we see is going to hit on an emergency basis, we notify the world.
I know you must have processes for the government operators to warn them about any possible collision, but what type of do you have with the private operators? How do they know this, and how do you contact them, or how do they contact you, or how do they watch you and listen for you?
Sir, we have a tracking network of about 21 different sensors around the globe that track what I will call element sets or addresses in space of objects, debris, or satellites. We post that on a website, www.spacetrack.org. Anybody can get on there, and all of the addresses or a large portion of the things that are in space we put out there publicly for everybody to have.
And a private operator has just as good an operation as the government operators to know of your work.
They have that data. For those that enter into agreements with us, we actually go beyond that, and we provide some services to them in addition to that data. And then again, on an emergency basis, even for those that don't have agreements.
Many of them know that they need to have that agreement with you.
They all know, and we've got 41 different companies now that have it. We've got 5 different nations that we've signed agreements with, and there's 5 or 6 more in the hopper right now going through the negotiations of that as we speak.
Well, I think your work's very, very important, and I think I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. The chair next recognizes Mr. Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. I had another hearing, a markup from another committee, and I will be reading your testimony. And I think this issue is vitally important for the future, not only of the United States, but of all of humankind. The debris issue is not a secondary issue. Debris is something that will limit humankind's ability to use space for our benefit and to uplift mankind, humankind. This is, and we're getting to a point of saturation now where either we deal with it or we will suffer the consequences of this limited and this limit on the benefits that we can utilize space for. One need only take a look at how we rely on space for weather, for communications. You name it. We have brought down the cost of telephone calls so dramatically with the use of space. We have agriculture that now depends on space. The GPS. We have whole economies based on space that are now in jeopardy because we're not cleaning up our trash. And we need to make sure that we just not track it. It's like tracking trash in space is not the answer. What the answer is, eliminating the trash from space. And this shouldn't be just something the American taxpayer needs to bear the burden of. We need to make sure that we have an initiative. And we should, hopefully, this hearing will provide step number one towards creating an international initiative to clear space debris from orbital space. I would imagine that our friends in the EU and Russia and perhaps I can't speak for China, considering the fact that they have contributed so much to this problem as of late. But we should make this an international effort, and the steps should be made to get this thing moving. Otherwise, we're putting all of these wonderful assets that we have invested in and that are currently helping improve the condition of humankind, we're putting them at risk. Let me note, the chairman, our chairman of the full committee, just mentioned that we talked about near-Earth objects, and when he was chairman, and I think that we probably have something where we're tracking them a little bit more than what we were then. But I don't think that we have done anything that right now that we could count on to say, if we see a near-Earth object that's going to hit the Earth and destroy large numbers of people, whether or not we have a system in place that we could then activate to deflect that near-Earth object. I don't believe that system is in place. Well, we've got two major threats there, things we should be able to work on with our allies and friends throughout the world in order to achieve this as a human goal, a goal for all of humankind, as they say. So thank you very much for your testimony. I will be reading it. I'm sorry that I missed and I would be happy to yield to my colleague from Maryland. Is that did you want some time? I'd be happy to yield.
Does the gentleman from California have any more questions?
Oh, I'm done.
All right. Thank you. The chair at this point, subject to the call for votes on the House floor, is going to entertain a second round of questions, and I'm going to defer my second round at this point and recognize the ranking member from Maryland, Ms. Edwards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And the reason I wanted Mr. Rohrbacher to stay is because in Mr. Weeden's testimony, he had a recommendation for the executive branch to clarify its strategy for assessing the orbital debris removal, and it really struck a chord because in our bipartisan committee-passed bill just a couple of weeks ago, we actually included a provision in there that would require NASA, in collaboration with other relevant federal agencies, to review the concepts and technological options for removing orbital debris from low Earth orbit. So, I mean, getting to this question of not just looking at it and knowing where it is, all very important, but what's going to be our strategy for removing it? Because we actually need to free up some of that space, too, for all the additional activity that's going on. And so I wonder if any of you have any views, Mr. Weeden, starting with you, about what an effective approach NASA might take to address this particular provision, assuming that it does become law.
It's a very interesting question. It's a very challenging question because at the moment there's no single technology that seems to be the answer. There are a couple of different technologies that have some promise. And so I think a first step would probably be to figure out what those technologies are and then look for how are we going to mature those technologies. Because at the moment they exist. We generally know theoretically they're probably going to work, but most of them have not been demonstrated in an operational manner. So it would be identifying what the most promising technologies are, and then some sort of a strategy to mature them, do risk reduction, and towards some sort of a demonstration mission on orbit of one or more of these technologies. And I think that's probably going to have to be an international demonstration mission in nature, given the nature that all the debris is international, right? A country can only really touch the things that it owns, and so there's going to have to be some level of cooperation there.
Well, given that the United States mostly tracks all of it, I'd assume that we should be able to get some cooperation. General Raymond, is there a role that DoD can play in terms of maturing some of these technologies?
Ma'am, there's a lot of discussions that are going on around the world on this problem, and it is an important issue. I think there are roles that we could help. I have not heard to date, though, any specific technology that's out there that I see is something near term that is going to be able to solve this problem.
Mr. Nelson, I think you wanted to.
Yeah, I think Mr. Weeden touched on it. The technologies and being able to take the items out of orbit and getting them out of orbit is very important. Obviously, the sooner you get it out, the likelihood is that they won't crash into something else. The issue, though, comes down to is whether or not you take out, and you made that mention as well, somebody else's piece of debris. The flags are flying on that, even if it's not usable. That particular item has the flag of another country. So there probably is going to have to be some sort of treaty work or something along those lines, or agreements made between nations in order to be able to effectively work that out.
Right. Well, I know that Goddard Space Flight Center has some rather robust activity going on now to try to look at ways to reservice some of these decommissioned satellites as a way to get them back in service, not put new ones up. But that too is a long way down the line, but something that I think we need to invest in. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield.
Thank you. Mr. Rohrabacher, we have time for another round of questions on your end if you have any additional questions. The House floor vote has not yet been called.
I would just like to suggest that we make this the first step and not just a public relations this is a problem. We can do something in Congress to work with these folks and to work with people internationally. When I travel overseas, I'm in the Foreign Affairs Committee. I always, when I go to another country, I go and talk to their space people, and every time I talk to their space people, whether it's Russia or Japan or Europe, they all are in tune with that. This is a challenge that we're going to have to someday deal with, because it's coming to the point now where it's imperative to deal with it because it's limiting what we can do in space. So let me see. I would just say, okay. Have any of you had any talk with, for example, the Russians or the EU or Japan on this issue?
Sure. The FAA is engaged with a lot of international partners to include the European Space Agency, and we have letters of agreement with countries like Spain and
right.
Curacao. There is, because it's such a big international problem, there is international will to attack it. And one thing that we have an opportunity to do here is to identify a civil agency that can represent the United States, which is the biggest operator out in orbit, to take a leadership role as we begin to address the problem.
Well, I remember one of the directors of the space program in Russia telling me that they had been thinking about almost as a bulldozer type of thing where you had some kind of a big shield in front of something that would go forward and get a hold of some of this debris. We actually are we studying anything that would be? I mean, there's one idea. I mean, I'm not saying it's good or bad. Are we really you mentioned that we don't have any, or is there a program on that is actually trying to develop the technology on this?
At the moment, I'm only aware of one NASA-funded program to do some technology development. It refers to what's known as an electrodynamic tether, which is a spacecraft that can use the combination of electrical field and the Earth's magnetic field to maneuver without using fuel aside from sunlight. Mm-hmm. And the technology is fairly early stages, but it could be one of the more efficient ways of moving around to gather debris. I'm not aware of any other U.S. government-funded programs to do the technology development. But I will say that in reference to your question about international efforts, next month there's going to be a meeting hosted by CNES, the French Space Agency, that has participation from Japan, from NASA, from Russia, from a number of other countries. It's a 3-day workshop looking at technology and engineering solutions for this.
Oh, really? Where will that be?
It'll be in Paris. They've held this workshop every 2 years. This is the third instance of it.
And what days are they?
It'll be June 16th, 17th, 18th, around there.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I would suggest that someone from this committee go to that hearing, or that meeting.
Is that a request?
Mr. Chairman, he may have to compete with the chairman and the ranking member.
Does the gentleman from California have any more questions? All right, let me exercise my prerogative and now ask my question. General Raymond, if an event like the Cosmos Iridium collision happened today, how would JFCC respond? Specifically, can you give the committee a sense of the process that goes into actions to protect our astronauts on the International Space Station or other national security and commercial assets that could be threatened by such an event?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. If an event happened where two satellites collided, it obviously would generate debris. We would detect that debris with our network of sensors around the globe. We would characterize that debris. We would get an orbital element, or the address in space, if you will, of that debris, and we would refine that over time, and we would put that debris into our catalog. Once it's in the catalog, as I discussed earlier, we have the process in place that we do for every active satellite on orbit. We would screen against that debris to ensure that we provided proper warning if something were to collide.
That's the vote call, but we still have 15 minutes before we have to be on the House floor. Quick follow-up question. How long does it take, generally speaking, for the orbital debris to have its orbit decay to the point where it goes back to Earth and it's no longer an issue?
Mr. Chairman, there's lots of factors that are involved in that.
Is there some kind of average number of years or decades or a range?
Sir, I don't have that at my fingertip, and I don't think there really is. There's so many factors that are involved. It's altitude, size, shape, speed, velocity. There's a whole bunch of things. We do predict reentries, and we track those reentries. We track those. We warn against them when they're going to reenter. But I can't tell you. I can't give you a time for how many years. But when it gets close, we can characterize that reentry, and we warn against that as well.
Mr. Nelson, you wanted to add something?
Yes, the general actually hit on the issues. It's basically the altitude, the shape of the object, the mass of the object, and it can range there's a very, very large range from tomorrow to maybe a million years from now. So depending on where that particular object is, so that brings up the issue of basically taking it out of the orbit.
Mr. Weeden?
Just to give you some ballpark numbers, at the altitude of the International Space Station, I would say a rough estimate on the order of months to maybe a very short number of years. When you move up higher, let's say around 800 kilometers, where most of the remote sensing satellites are and the greatest congestion of debris is, and the collision was, and the Chinese anti-satellite test was, at that altitude you're talking decades or longer. And once you get beyond 1,000 kilometers, for all intents and purposes, it's up there pretty much, as far as we're concerned, forever.
Right, thank you. General Raymond, as a follow-up to my earlier question to you, FAA requested in their written testimony for the authority to require operators to move positions if a possible collision is detected. How would your process change, if at all, if that authority is granted to the FAA?
Sir, the FAA would still rely on the data that we get from our sensors. We'd be providing that data today. We warn of those conjunctions. We do not have the authority to make a satellite operator move. I can for DoD satellites, but I can't make commercial satellites move. I don't have that authority. But they would take our data that we have and use that data in their new role.
Thank you. Any other follow-up on that? Yes, sir, Mr. Zamka.
Yes, sir. If I may, the request to have the ability to have an operator be forced to move, That can be done in a number of ways. Earlier is better, earlier interaction, perhaps agree with the operator as part of the licensing process what the criteria would be for which they'd move. And then probably best of all would be an industry-based consensus on what is the agreeable time to effect a move, because all these things involve probabilities and a lot of expense for the operator, frankly.
All right. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for you, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from the members. The witnesses are excused, and this hearing is adjourned.